Yes, things in life are free, but you can give them to the birds and bees. I want money.
Hello, and welcome to our first lecture on the political economy. Our main concern in this lecture is to establish a framework and basic vocabulary for thinking about the political economy. This will help us examine the relationship between the market and the state in general, and the degree of state intervention in the economy in particular. So let's get started with building our vocabulary. The political economy is an area of study examining the interactions between states and markets. Naturally, by now you know exactly what we mean when we say state in comparative politics. A market, in the economic sense, is an arena of exchange, or a mechanism of choice as to how firms produce goods and how consumers obtain and use those goods. This isn't too far from how you'd probably use the word market in everyday language. Here's a market in Kabul that probably looks a bit like your mental image of a market, those centers of exchange that spring up all over the world. They are places people go to buy and to sell. This is the basic idea of a market in the political economy sense, except we mean something bigger and more abstract than a specific market. In the political economy, we're talking about the market. Now, the market is an enormous aggregation of all producers, sellers, and consumers, and the patterns of exchange among them. Obviously, it's not a physical place like a town or city market, but an abstract entity meant to symbolize how people produce and consume. This includes patterns of decision-making, physical wealth and capital, and more fluid flows of money and labor. It's the arena in which people make decisions. They make decisions such as how many products, let's say Volkswagens, they will make, where they will get the resources to make those cars, where, how, and when they will make them, and how they will be distributed, and where consumers make decisions about how to obtain and then use them. Now, there are many ways the market can be arranged, and indeed, it is different from state to state and from time to time. Thus, the market is a tricky and slippery term, because depending on context, it can mean the market of a single region, a state, a whole continent, a specific type of good or commodity, or the entire world market. The free market is an economic arrangement in which private individuals and firms, not the state, make all decisions about buying and selling private property, such as land, stock, commodities, or productive industries. This term is technically not the exact same thing as capitalism, which means the free market rights of buying and selling without intervention alongside the elevation of private property. But the two terms are used interchangeably for most purposes, and we'll use them interchangeably here. Free market capitalism is premised on the idea that supply and demand will always lead to the most efficient allocation of economic resources. That is, producers will determine how much to make and what prices to set by the amount of demand from consumers. The market works by encouraging competition among firms, which inspires them to produce the best product at the lowest price that they possibly can. This leads to innovations in production as well as in terms of the quality and capabilities of the outputs that they produce. Thus, the basic premise of the ideology of the free market is that individuals trying to maximize their own monetary gains will actually produce the best outcomes for society. Firms in competition with one another will strive to be most efficient in producing just the right amount of supply to meet demand, and to produce a supply of the best quality for the lowest price possible. Adam Smith captured this idea with the concept of the invisible hand, noting that in the free market, the interplay between producers and buyers, all striving to make the most money, creates the most efficient system. Of course, we know from our 20th century history that the free market was not the only organization of the market offered by economic thinkers. Its very opposite is the command economy, in which the state determines supply and demand. Thus, in a command economy, best exemplified by the communist Soviet Union in the middle of the last century, the state decides who makes what, how much they make, how they make it, how much it costs, and where it is distributed. The state also determines each individual's salary, often even rationing out how much of each product they can have. This seems like a crazy idea to most of us today, but it is rooted in Marxist thought, and for people in many circumstances, it sounds like a great idea. For those who have nothing and work constantly, while seeing the few who seem to have more than they could ever use in the first place, the concept that the state can allocate the resources most fairly and equitably is quite enticing. The command economy was justified by the Marxist-communist ideology, which held that the free market led to a political order in which the wealthy bourgeois classes essentially controlled all of society, and thus the state had to take this power away from them in order to create a fair society for the workers. If you think about it, it's pretty obvious that a command economy is not compatible with democracy. Democracy is predicated upon limiting the state and giving the people at least partial control over its actions. However, a complete command economy requires that the state dictate everything about the economy, and that clearly cannot coexist with the liberties that are central to liberal democracy. That is not to say, however, that all dictatorships are command economies. On the contrary, there are many authoritarian states that have extremely free markets, such as Singapore. Democracies are also not all purely free market. As we will see in great detail later, there are some democracies like Ireland and the United States that do have relatively unrestricted economies, even if they are not perfectly free market. While there are many others, such as Germany and Japan, where the state intervenes quite heavily in the free market. Indeed, as these cases will show us, the central issue in determining the relationship between the market and the state is not an either-or, complete free market versus complete command economy decision. No, it is much more nuanced and complicated than that. Both the free market and the command economy are ideal types, those abstract concepts that never actually perfectly exist in the real world. Over the course of the 20th century, it did become relatively obvious that some form of the free market produced better economic growth. This is not to say that it creates a perfect or just society, but instead that the individual motivation to create profit leads to much more aggregate productivity and wealth than a command economy, in which individual ambition is thwarted, and thus the overall economy suffers as a result. Indeed, it has often been remarked that on paper, communism, with its equitable distribution of wealth in the name of a fair society, is a more desirable system than capitalism on paper, which explicitly allows for inequality. In terms of what works with humans, however, capitalism has been shown to produce better outcomes. However, all states regulate their free market, and the issue of where and how to draw the line between the state, or the public sector, and the market, or the private sector, is an enduring political debate. We are going to begin thinking about this debate by breaking the role of the state in regulating the market into three categories. First, believe it or not, the state is essential to any functioning of the free market whatsoever. The state can exist without the free market, as in a command economy. However, without the state, the free market simply is not feasible. Second, there are some roles that many people have come to see as beneficial. These are things that the state can do that improves the functioning of the free market economy and are thus not actually very controversial. Finally, we get to the controversial issues, or what we might call the contentious, politically generated roles of the state. They are politically generated because in some cases they may not necessarily lead to more efficient functioning of the market, but they are demanded by large sections of the electorate. So the state may grow to accommodate these roles. So let's take a look at each of these in turn, starting with the necessary roles of the state. As I mentioned, without the state there is no market. This will often seem very counterintuitive, especially to Americans who grow up used to the idea that it is the state that is always in the way of a flourishing market. That's only because we take many of the state's roles in facilitating the free market economy for granted. For the market to work, the state must be in place to provide security and stability, to create and regulate the currency, to enforce private property rights, and to provide contract law. Think of it this way. You are a business owner and you want to produce your product, for which you need raw materials. You sign a contract with the sellers of those raw materials. You give them your money, as specified by that contract, and they take that money, but they don't give you the materials. What do? You sue the jerks, using the state's legal system. What about if bandits try to take over your factory? The state's security apparatus is there to help you. Indeed, the stronger the state's capacity, the more rational bureaucratic that state, the better it is for you as a business owner, because the more likely you are to have a fair trial over that contract, and to not have to bribe the cops to provide you protection. If you want to think about what a free market looks like without the state, think of the mafia. They have to enforce their own contracts in the most unsavory ways, and it's clearly not feasible to do that on a large scale and still provide economic growth. Thus, the mafia sticks to dealing with illicit goods and services, and the state produces a basic regulatory framework for the market to function. Outside of these absolutely essential roles of the state, there are many beneficial roles, like building infrastructure and capital, that encourage investment. States provide roads and schools and plumbing and all sorts of things that you'd need to build a successful business. Of course, these aren't essential, as businesses could build their own roads to facilitate production and distribution, but it's pretty uncontroversial to say that it typically makes a lot more economic and practical sense to have the state coordinate these projects. This brings up another way that states and markets are intertwined, however, as to build this infrastructure, the state must extract taxes. So the state requires the success of businesses in the first place so that it can take out the taxes to invest in its infrastructure. Finally, we come to the controversial topic of politically generated rules of the state. These are politically generated because they are not strictly necessary for the functioning of the state, but many people within the state want that state to fill these roles. Here we are talking about things like whether the state should provide rules on workers' rights, bans on child labor or environmental destruction, the degree to which the state should provide health care or education, and most of all, the degree to which the state should combat inequality with social provisions, or what many Americans call welfare. These issues can be contentious, with great portions of the society within a state demanding them, and others fiercely opposing them. Indeed, we will see when we analyze political conflict within democracies more closely that these are some of the most ever-present issues across both different states and different elections within states. So now you have a basic framework to think about some of the most contentious issues in all of politics, the role that the state does not, and should play in regulating the economy. You've learned that it is impossible for the free market to function completely independently from the state, and you will continue to learn that there are many ways for these interactions to differ across states and time. Let's conclude with one last distinction, the distinction between objective and subjective arguments. In thinking about the line between public and private, there are countless good, valid arguments. Some of these have to do with rather dry and complex arguments about the real state of the world. For instance, we objectively can compare the economic growth of the Soviet Union and its communist satellites to the West, and we can make a relatively objective argument that a command economy just can't keep up with a largely free market economy in the long run. Political scientists and economists and policy analysts are in a constant struggle to produce as much objective information about the world as possible, so they can construct these objective arguments to make the best policies. On the other hand, a surprising amount of what we take as fact is actually subjective information. To be subjective means to be based in our own unique view of the world and in our own unique experiences. There is no objective right or wrong with subjective issues, and this is often the case when we are determining where to draw the line between public and private. Often, it just comes down to what we think is more desirable. Thus, we wrestle with inherent philosophical tensions between freedom and equality, and our own subjective views of the good when we try to determine what the state's role in the economy should be. We wrestle with ancient questions, such as that biblical query, "Am I my brother's keeper?" In some places, people take it as obvious that yes, I am my brother's keeper. I must try to eradicate inequality. In other places, it's taken for granted that inequality is the way for an increase in incentives to work. We'll see that the axis of political competition is drastically different from place to place. But the point we really must remember is that our own opinions are a complex mix of objective states of the world and our own subjective desires as to how the world should be and what the good life is. Let that be a reminder to resist the temptation to call others wrong when you debate these complex issues, and to try and find out what is common in your worldviews to build a foundation for understanding. Well, I'll get off my soapbox and leave you with that thought. Thank you so much for your attention.
Who makes your money? Who makes your money? Who thinks they might? And who's gonna be there to take that fight? Some try to relax, some try to know, some try to get there, but no place to go, no place to go. Who makes your money? Who makes your money?